Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. I am Constantine Martelli, joined, as always, by GSP, and there was quite a bit of news that came out in these past few days because I know our last episode was just over the weekend. That was on Saturday night, but
hmm
since then, since Monday, a lot has happened, particularly with the earthquake in Turkey, which, again, that's still a very much developing story, but so much has happened that I think we do need to touch on it now. And certainly we'll need a follow up to this as well. But without further ado, we'll get right into it because it was. Yeah, I mean, I think it took us all off guard. You can't really predict something like this unless. I don't know, unless there's any, like, real.
Oh yeah.
Oh, no. I know exactly where you're going with this. I do
No,
want.
no, we will not enter that territory.
We will not enter that territory, but I was actually going to address it to say why I don't believe it. But I will say if there's any I don't know geology enthusiasts out in the audience, perhaps you can correct me. Perhaps there are ways to predict these things. I mean, I know there are ways, but like perhaps there's. But again, those are generalities. Again, geology isn't really my wheelhouse. So if there's anyone who knows a little bit more about that, I would love to hear it. But from everything I have read, this is not a shock given the way the Eastern Mediterranean sits geographically on the tectonic plates. And that historically this area has been prone to earthquakes, but I would say, like everyone in every era, we always fall into the trap to think that we're invincible to this kind of thing, that this kind of thing would certainly never happen to us. And, well, yeah, of course it happens, but why would we even be on the receiving end of that? Now, I'm not saying we as in, like, me in particular, but we as in the generality, because, of course, I have not been impacted by this in the slightest being on the other side of the world, but there were also several aftershocks I saw that took place in Turkey proper. There were small ones in the West Bank as well, but across the Eastern Mediterranean, both the earthquake and the aftershocks were felt. I believe it was about a 7 is what they said for the magnitude.
7.8 or something like that.
Yeah, it was not as big, correct me if I'm wrong, not as big as the one that caused Fukushima and the tsunami in Japan about 11, 12 years ago, but in terms of the damage done, actually, it was, from what it looks like right now, worse. I think collectively between Turkey and Syria, there is a confirmed count of upwards of 11,000 dead and several thousand more injured. And of course, this is at a very vital time between the two nations of Turkey and Syria, and a very fragile time as well. And it would have to be something like this that would be the derailment of a lot of the progress we have seen in that region for the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. But I'm not going to say anything too soon because of how early the story is. But the ramifications of this are likely going to be years, even under the best circumstances. That they the impact of this will be felt for years. And some of the footage was it was I had to say unbelievable in terms of watching it. It felt I'm not of course implying in any way it was fake, but it felt like a work of fiction. It felt like something that you wouldn't really expect to see in a real life situation, with the buildings crumbling and just these things just what more or less looks like they're sinking into the ground. And with that, there has been a lot of controversy over the response of both the Turkish government and the response of governments across the world, and speculation as to what the outcome of this will be and who can leverage this to their advantage wherever. So far, the Turkish government has declared states of emergencies in the affected provinces. Turkey has seen a lot more aid given to it than Syria has, and I'll get into some of the politics of the situation with the sanctions on Syria and the aid to it. But what I do have to say, my first impression, especially given the nature of the show, is that this will be used to get NGOs on the ground. They will do everything they can to bend these countries to their will, especially Turkey, in this time. And I think, frankly, the way Syria is being treated is, of course, far worse than Turkey. But speaking from a purely cynical perspective, looking at it as if you were a foreign policy strategist in Washington or London or Brussels, this is probably one of the best things that could have happened to you right now. I'll just say that in short before I hand it over to you.
Yeah, I'll just start off with a New York Times headline that was altered because they're already seeding this confusion about aid to Syria. And so the line originally read, the only border crossing for aid between Syria and Turkey is closed. And what follows is Syria is not able to receive direct aid from many countries because of sanctions. This was altered to read, the only border crossing for UN aid from Turkey to Syria is hobbled as the Syrian government tightly controls which aid it allows into opposition held areas. So they're trying to, you know what, Syria is well aware that the only places that are going to get help will be places that are anti-Assad. Okay. And there's not been one Western or European nation that has sent any kind of aid to Syria. All the aid that is coming in from Russia, China, Iran. Iran sent quite a few,
Yeah, I actually have
but even countries like Azerbaijan.
a
And
collective list here of countries that have been confirmed to send aid to Syria thus far. So that's Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, Algeria, Iran, Pakistan, the UAE, Iraq, Russia, Oman, Libya, of all countries, and India and Jordan. So those are the countries thus far that we have confirmed
yeah,
to have sent aid to Syria. And on the point of Western countries and aid, there was a completely mask off moment where the foreign minister of Greece said, upon trying to send aid to Syria, he saw that he could not because of the sanctions in place by the European Union and also by extension the United States. That no matter what they wanted to do, no matter what any of the constituent governments in Europe might have wanted to do, there is no avenue to send aid to Syria. And if you think about it, say something like this happened just even a year earlier. They, despite the pre existing sanction on Russia from 2014 onward, probably could have cooperated with Russia on this matter to send it through there, but that avenue is completely closed. And with all of that, again, it is completely shut off. Any avenue of aid is carefully curated, and you already have several organizations, several NGOs, and governments for that matter, who are only sending aid, as you said, to the opposition held areas. I saw one that was only sending aid into Idlib, of all places.
that includes Al Qaeda affiliated groups like HTS. That's all it is.
Yeah, that's to the shock of nobody, I would imagine. And although there were no aid packages sent, there was, I do think, a brief emergency response that actually saw Netanyahu offer aid to Syria, which, I mean, I think we all know the play behind that, but it is interesting to see, given the position that Israel is in, that it is at least seemingly trying to make new inroads with its neighbors, especially as the political dynamic and the geopolitical dynamic does change so much in the region and the world altogether. But as to compare the countries that sent aid to Turkey, because sanctions are non existent on Turkey, that was a much larger group, such as Romania, the Netherlands, Italy, Azerbaijan, Switzerland, Greece, Poland, the European Union, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Algeria, Cuba, uh, Singapore, Malaysia, China, Ireland, Qatar, Canada, Jordan, Tunisia, France, Egypt, Ukraine of all countries, the United Arab Emirates, Russia, Lebanon, New Zealand, Morocco, Sweden, Japan, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Spain, Germany, the U.S., Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Armenia, and India. So there were quite a few in common there, but the ones that weren't, once again, were mostly the EU countries and the US because of the sanctions packages that were in place. And the implications I think this has, especially on the eve of the election, with Erdogan seemingly being a shoo-in, I do think if anything can dislodge his chance of winning re-election is the response to this and how it's handled and whether it's botched, and also how the dynamics with the foreign powers are handled with receiving this aid. So there is a lot that we could say that is just speculation, and I'm okay with a bit of speculation, but I don't want to stray too far because after a certain point, there's only really so much you can say. And as I said before, this is likely a topic that's going to take 2 or 3 shows to fully cover, maybe even more. This is going to likely be recurring given the nature of something like this and how this develops. I doubt we've seen the end of it in terms of casualties, whether it be just injuries or outright deaths. And for the time being, I don't think this is going to lead to any major upheaval in either country, but the potential is always there. In fact, I do think that Syria is more likely to see the major upheaval for obvious reasons because even after this, you still have the sanctions on Syria and you still have the withholding of their natural resources due to the American occupation force in eastern Syria, where they're not getting their oil, they're not getting their grains, and that has caused enough strain on the country as it is. And while I don't believe Syria is going to turn into what it was, say, in 2015 or 2016, I do think as material conditions degrade, especially in the part of Syria that was impacted, violence becomes exponentially more likely.
Yes, I mean, I think they want to return to Syria to the way it was 8 years ago, even earlier, 9, 10 years ago. They would be happy with that. Um, they would be happy that it's just some crazy Al Qaeda affiliated place that's run by, shadowy finance coming from America, Israel, and various Gulf states. Kind of the way Libya is. There's probably other states that are, as far as Libya, that are funded depending on which side, but the goal is destabilization, right? That's the essential goal is destabilize Syria as much as possible. And the irony, for people who complain about, yeah, but the Iranians are in Syria, it's like you literally brought them there. Syria complied and went with the US in ways that even Turkey didn't prior to the invasion of Iraq the second time. And, Assad should never have trusted them. He
They
should
gave up their
never have trusted
WMDs
them.
as well
And
in
as a,
2014. And then they still, after they gave up their
yes,
chemical weapon stockpiles, accused them 3 separate occasions of using chemical weapons.
yes. So, word to the wise, never give up your WMTs. Always work diligently to create your own nuclear weapons if you want your own sovereignty. That's the bottom line, right? Because America is going to continue to go with this idea that the whole world needs to be denuclearified, and of course they're going to call it like a global governance, but it will be America, and people don't like hearing that. But I'll give you two examples. America's had several illegal wars. Did the Olympic Commission ever stop them from hoisting their flag? Were they ever barred from participating in the Olympics?
Oh, of
I mean,
course
they
not.
qualify. So, so now you know who has the last say in the Olympics, right? Now, this has to be a universal pretense there, but ultimately, there's one country here that does not suffer. Well, there's more than one, yes, but America
But
is a big obvious
they're all the
target
proxies of
that
America, so it all
yes,
adds
and
up in
they
the
and
end.
they could be they could have been sanctioned. Yeah. Um,
Like I know Saudi Arabia
take
has
for
taken
instance,
an interesting turn, but I mean they've been able to act free of consequences for decades now. Now, as we move into another era, as
yeah,
Saudi Arabia is a less steadfast partner of the American empire, maybe we might see sanctions on Saudi Arabia or some sort of equivalent action. But for the several years, several decades prior to that, they've been able to do more or less wherever they want.
right, right, and but Westoids love to virtue signal. So the latest that I saw on the BBC today was they want to, because they just cannot give up on regime change in Russia. So what they want to do is charge Putin, because now they think they have evidence that Putin sent Buk's air defense missiles to the rebels in Donbass, and it was a Buk that knocked down MH17, the plane. I believe that was in the summer of 2014. And jokingly, I've said, don't you think the people who did that should get a medal? Who shot it down? And people are like horrified. It's like, bro, America blew up a civilian aircraft in the Persian Gulf in 1988 from Iran. I believe it was flight F-165, and the crew got medals. Like, spare me. when you
Yeah,
when you
it's
say that, they're speechless. They're speechless. And America never denied it, right? So like, I literally don't care. I don't care. Um, so yeah, but back to the earthquake, I would say that, you know, I have a friend who told me one of his neighbors is Turkish, and they're very upset, and they're blaming Erdogan. You know, I don't know how many people are going to blame Erdogan for this. As far as I know, Erdogan cannot start or stop earthquakes. Turkey has had many earthquakes in the last century. Apparently, the worst one was in, I believe, 1938, where again thousands of people died. And the death toll now is well over 10,000. It's horrific, and it wasn't just one earthquake; it was the aftershocks, and then I believe it was. I want to get this right. Um, I believe it was in a town. It's south central Turkey. Dejanbet, something. I wish I could remember. Damn it! And I can't find my screen cap. Um, but there was another earthquake that happened the next day, almost as strong, about 160 kilometers north. I think it's safe to say that we haven't even probably seen most of the videos, and won't know the final death toll for quite some time. But it is very serious, and Erdogan has an election in May of this year. Um, he has called on it, and he made it sooner rather than later. That's interesting. I don't know what he knows to have moved it, but under Turkish law, he can. Um, there will be heavy duty criticism. I'm very sure that NGOs in Turkey will be working very hard. He has partially suspended. Twitter and various social media and Wi-Fi. I don't know about Wi-Fi, but various social media platforms, because he knows that's what will happen. Um, it will be blamed on him, and I can recall similar things in the U.S. With I forget the name of that hurricane with George Bush Jr.
Katrina.
It was his fault, and Katrina, yes, Hurricane Katrina. Um, Thank you. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't pretend to know Turkey or modern Turkish history enough to make a bet which way this is going to go. I think it's too early to say. It will all depend on the kind of effective rescue operations and rebuilding he's going to do. Because a lot of these buildings, let's face it, they went down because they were poorly constructed. They were not constructed under, with various standards. Like I said, the real last severe earthquake. They've had many. Don't get me wrong, where hundreds of people died, and it doesn't excuse them. It wasn't in 1938. I'm just saying that I would say post World War II knowledge of construction to deal with earthquakes is much better. And for one reason or another, they didn't spend money reconstructing, or I mean, they will now. So this is a big deal. It all depends on how Erdogan handles this. If he handles it poorly, and really he only has about, I would say, 2.5 months to prove that he's done a good job. It's not a lot of time, and I think it's very precarious. Anything can happen now.
Yes, I was just about to say it does all come down to the response to it. And touching on the construction thing once again, architecture is also not my wheelhouse, but it does call in a lot of logical questions as to when these buildings were constructed, how they were constructed, who constructed them. But when it comes to the mind of the average voter, whether that be in the United States, whether that be in Western Europe, whether that be in Turkey, which more or less shows the real farce of democracy, you're always going to point the finger to the guy on top, just because that is the natural instinct as to what to do. So even though Erdogan did not order or oversee the construction of these buildings, because he's the one in charge, if the response is inadequate in the eyes of the Turkish people, then their wrath will be taken out on him. And as for the election, it also does call
Yes.
into question, will there be a suspension of the election? I doubt it would go that far. I mean, but we do also have to remember Turkey is a nation that also has had several coups since the foundation of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. At one point, it was about a once in every decade event. Of course, we had the attempt in 2016. But the idea of a seizure of power or a temporary suspension of quote unquote democracy is not unheard of. So I don't want to say anything too certain for the time being because of how early the situation is. But although there's a lot of room for scrutiny in this, speaking once again from those purely Machiavellian terms, there also is a lot of room to make very expedient political moves on the part of Erdogan, where there is a lot of opportunity, especially with some of these emergency declarations, for him to consolidate and expand his power, which could also have an outcome in regard to the 2023 election and beyond.
Yeah. I would I would I would say buckle up. There's probably going to be all kinds of shenanigans. I already saw it on the BBC, a little expose that they had on the white helmets. They're the only people in Idlib. They're the only people that are helping the Al Qaeda families. It's just so ridiculous. Um, I mean, nobody wants to see these people suffer, but you know what they're doing. They want to keep those jihadists, and they even say in their own video that they're jihadists, right? Now, Afrin is another case because it's controlled by the Kurds, um, which has come under attack by the Turks. And frankly, like in that area, there's also a substantial Kurdish population on the Turkish side, more so in eastern Turkey rather than south central, but there are Kurds in that area. Um, I'm just wondering, like, what I think the effects are on Syria are going to be very severe. In many ways, I think it's really beholden on China to do more. I don't think they have to acknowledge what they are involved with now, right?
I mean,
Um,
China even sent aid
I
to
know that
Turkey, but
they're
not Syria.
afraid.
So there, that
They did send.
that I did find interesting, and do continue with that.
Yeah, I mean, they're the ones who financially can do the most to preserve Syria, and in fact, they're going to have to. I know they're afraid of American retaliation. Um, and there's no telling like what the U.S. will do. But the fact that Iran is already sending like huge planes full of supplies to Syria, and thank goodness that for now, anyways, that the Israelis and the Americans haven't shut down these planes. Um, well, I'll commend them where it's due. But India as well is sending help. So I think like they have to acknowledge that 2022 is the year that really the world changed in a very significant way, and it's not going to go back to the way it was for a long time.
And once again, when you have a coalition of secondary and tertiary powers built around the number two and three player in the world, whether you consider Russia or China number two is really up for debate. I won't get into that for now. It's not really relevant to the point I'm trying to make here. Is you can form an effective bloc against the hegemonic power of the world when you have a coalition like that, when you have something like the now expanded BRICS.
Hmm.
And what I will also say, particularly when it comes to Turkey and to a lesser degree in Syria, the international response to this is also going to be crucial because, especially for something like Turkey, a country like Turkey, it is going to sway public opinion on how they feel about foreign affairs. Because let's say Russia and China provide a very strong and coherent response, Russia, China, India, that once again that coalition of powers we were talking about, that is going to endear Turkey far more to them than whatever the American aid may be. Or conversely, if the Americans do have an outpouring of competent aid, it could bring Turkey more back into the Western orbit. I'm not saying entirely, but it could sway Turkey back,
Hmm.
especially depending on the Erdogan situation, whether he remains in power or not. So it is going to be an international competition to see who can do more for Turkey, especially because I think Syria is more or less a foregone conclusion. The U.S. is adamant on destroying the country, not even trying to flip it, not even trying to bring it in their sphere, just completely destroying the country. But Turkey, on the other hand, is the vital piece right there for this tug of war right now that both sides are going to put more or less everything they can into it. And it's really to be determined the quality and the amount of their aid and how that plays out, which will which way Turkey will be swayed by that. And I think there's a very real possibility, especially right now, as the U.S. is reorienting, as it is souring on Ukraine and focusing more on East Asia issues, such as Taiwan, that we could see a far greater focus on Turkey from the Eastern powers as opposed to the US and the European Union.
Yeah. Um, I would imagine that flipping Turkey for the U.S. is crucial for a Ukrainian victory. Uh, in many ways, is like the piece of the puzzle that no one looks at, uh, but it would be crucial, uh, especially because it has so much sway. But it would take a lot. and I don't know if there is the base for it in the Turkish public, because the Turks despise the Americans, and they don't like the Europeans that much either. There's a lot of bad blood over the years. That
Oh
doesn't
no,
mean that
whatever
Erdogan can't
goodwill
lose the
had been
election.
built up between the EU and Turkey or the US and Turkey has completely evaporated at this point. Now, that doesn't make them all Russophiles or necessarily sympathetic to China off the bat, but there is far more of an openness of cooperating with those powers as opposed to the song and dance they've been doing with the US and the EU. The EU especially, which baited Turkey with membership for
Hmm.
a decade at least, if not going back further, before completely throwing them under the bus. So that will really be the determining point. Is I say once again goes back to the amount of aid and how it's administered, and of course whether Erdogan weathers this crisis or not.
Hmm. Yeah, and in case people want to donate, I myself donated through the diocese, the archdiocese of the Antiochian Orthodox Church in America. I would not donate to anyone else. There's also the International Orthodox Church community, which you can donate. The reason for this is the sanctions on Syria are so severe that if you see other charities posing as charities that can give money to Syria, those funds will almost certainly never get to Syria. So,
Yeah, that's something always to be cautious of whenever you donate money on these kind of things is make sure it's somebody who is both capable of delivering the funds and also willing to deliver the funds because there are so many
mhm,
shell corporations out there that will once again they'll have all of this, but 90% of it goes to operating cost, and then by the time it actually trickles down to where it needs to be, it's effectively pointless to have given any aid at that point at all. But yeah, well, certainly, I'll remember
mhm.
to actually put these links down there because I know I'm a little bit flaky with the links sometimes, but I won't forget these ones. But that's all I had for this story. If you have any final thoughts on the earthquake or any ramifications thereof.
I don't actually. Other than that, yeah,
Well, I,
we'll have to see. This is the biggest game changer in the war in Syria that I think has happened since the Russians got involved.
oh, absolutely. And like I said, I can only speculate so much, but this is the one of the best case scenarios for the foreign policy planners of Washington, London, Brussels, etc. They could not have asked for a better event with better timing in terms of this, which does make me fearful that this may lead to, especially in Syria, a greater reignition of conflict, especially as it did start to come to a close.
Hmm.
But I suppose we can cover some of the news about Zelensky's world tour if you'd like to get into that, or if you have any other updates on
Yeah,
Ukraine you'd want to cover before
sure.
then. But I say we jump right into Zelensky. So he took visits to.
Um,
No, yeah, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you cut out. I didn't hear you, so I
Oh,
didn't know you started. So yeah, no, please go ahead.
he Zelensky, that is on state visits to both the UK and France. Now, the UK visit was far more brazen. The French visit was about what you would expect. He did have to temper himself somewhat. Now, not that much, but just ever so slightly around Macron because although we're not going to ever get any serious opposition of this out of France, there is going to be that front that illusion of opposition that Macron will always be the one saying, "Oh, well, we're going to have to eventually negotiate at some point, or we're going to eventually have to play it more reasonably at some point." Where he went to the UK and he had both Rishi Sunak, the current prime minister, and Boris Johnson, the disgraced but ever ambitious former prime minister, eating out of his hands. Now, Sunak
Yeah.
actually gave a much more moderated line saying, well, we can't provide you the fighters. We can still give you aid and everything, and we can give you 90% of what you ask for. But Boris Johnson was over there in a very disgusting manner, kissing his feet, saying, we can send you the Typhoons. Sure, we might have to get the approval from France, Germany, Italy, etc. But, oh, fret not, Ukraine will have Typhoons, and we'll send you pilots, and we'll send you trainers. So, what they had actually said was the British said it would take 3 years to have the Ukrainian Air Force
Yeah.
competently operating the Typhoons. So, but Zelensky said, well, with my pilots, I'm sure you can do it in 2.5 years. It's the complete brazenness, but
Right, right.
it is.
Yeah, he said that we already have a lot of pilots who know how to fly planes, and they already have 2.5 years of experience. I'm not sure if the translation was right. Like I know, like your the way you've uh, transcribed it is slightly different, but it's the idea was basically, oh no, no, we have lots of pilots that already have flown planes. They just haven't flown planes in a long time,
Yeah, I'm
and
sure their experience on the
I
MiG
mean, the
15.
Typhoon is yeah, I mean the Typhoon is a much more sophisticated aircraft. It was created by Britain, Germany, France, maybe Italy was involved as well. It would need the go ahead from all those four countries, which they'll probably get. Let's face it. And in fact, Sunak said that they will probably get. He couldn't. He said he can't see Germany obstructing
Well, of course not.
or any reason to obstruct. So
But once again, it calls into question the what is really the point of this? Because as the British had outright admitted, it's going to take 3 years to get the Ukrainian pilots acclimated to the Typhoons to even operate them. In which case, the war will either be over or a third world war. There's really no in between with that sort of situation. I suppose you could say maybe a low level guerrilla war, but Ukraine, by one means or another, will not have need of an air force with competent pilots because they will either have lost this war in any significant sense or have Western air forces over their skies fighting a third world war. So there's really no in between with that. So it does make you wonder. Okay, the tanks are a bit more reasonable. It takes a lot less time to get a tank crew acclimated than it would a fighter pilot, even somebody with experience on the Soviet planes. And of course, the missiles, the
mhm.
small arms, those all make sense. The artillery pieces, those all make sense. Those are something that, in a reasonable amount of time, you could acclimate it. Now, I think at this point, it's just delaying the inevitable. But the idea of sending fighters at this point is completely comical, and it is just it's a political move. It's the save face to show Russia that they're willing to do that in the event of the next conflict rather than trying to influence the outcome of this conflict. And it does make you wonder when it comes to these typhoons and when it comes to these advanced weapon systems in general, when it comes to the language barrier, because these systems are, of course, built to operate, and now I suppose with this case, it probably is multilingual with it being a multinational project. But the question is, like, are there even these weapon systems in Ukrainian? Is there even a way where they would be able to read the instruments or operate the aircraft and actually know what's going on? I mean, same with the tanks for that matter, just really any of the more advanced weaponry. How long will it take to acclimate these? Now, I suppose the argument you could make is that NATO has been pouring 8 years, and at this point 9 years, worth of aid and training into Ukraine in anticipation of this conflict. So they probably made some sort of contingency with that. And the question I ask you is then why did they hold off on giving them the Western weapons platform as opposed to Soviet surplus weapons platform? And the people that they would have selected, whether that be pilots or tankers, to operate these Western systems, you don't think they have fallen in battle already in terms of them being the most competent forces Ukraine probably has using the Soviet system? So, again, it raises so many questions about after a certain point, what is the point of this? Honestly, if they announced they were giving them more javelins like they did at the beginning of the war, frankly, that would make more sense than sending them
Hmm.
Typhoons or F-16s or any Western fighter, for that matter.
I mean, I think the perception is that heavy weapons are not us. Like medium to light weapons are not enough. Like, ironically, they'll tell you how incredibly effective the javelins were. Like in Zelensky's speech in Parliament today, where he spoke to all the ministers, javelins literally saved Kiev. Literally saved Kiev. It's really just the most stupid things, but people will believe them. Let's not forget that you know, Ukraine before the war started already had 5 years worth of javelin production that they've burned through in 11 months. Um, they had 13 years of Stingers that they've burned through, right? And I think the idea is that obviously that's not enough. They work beautifully, but it's still not enough. And the perception is that they need the big heavy weapons. They cannot win without the big heavy weapons. And really, like in a way, there's been a real shift this week and the let's say the weekend and Friday of last week, because now you're having stories in the New York Times basically saying that you know Ukraine is worn out. They are outgunned and outnumbered. Morale is falling. This comes on the heels of some of the stuff that was published by The Guardian, but also the broader picture that was supplied by CSIS and the RAND Corporation. So the headlines are changing, right? And obviously the U.S. wants to prolong this war as much as possible. Even the 400 or so tanks that are promised to Ukraine, they're not all going to get there at once. And while they are, let's say, better tanks, or some of them are better tanks, I wouldn't say the Leopard ones are better tanks than what they had. Just remember that in the spring and summer, they were already sent 400 tanks of modified T-72s, some T-80s,
I also do want to touch
and
on a point
T-64s.
of a finer point of the idea of tank warfare. So, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who may have a bit more knowledge about this, but to my understanding, on the Western Front, particularly of World War II, it was generally agreed upon that the Germans had higher quality tanks, but the British, and especially the Americans, and the American capacity to produce tanks was so much more that they won by sheer numbers. And it's generally accepted that at the end of the day, when
Yeah,
it comes to overwhelming numbers, that's how tank warfare is won. And when you look at Russia, we're talking about the largest stockpiles of tanks in the world. I think something upwards of 20,000. So even if you do believe the initial claims of
yeah,
Russia has lost 1,000 tanks thus far in the war, well, they still have 19,000 in reserve. What's the big deal there? So after a certain point, when it comes to that,
right,
there is no winning in a tank war against Russia unless you are going to have every NATO army on the ground in Ukraine, because the stockpiles are that
right.
large in Russia, to the point where if it really comes down to it, even if they do have to dig out old T-72s, or even going back to like T-54s or whatever the oldest piece they have in their arsenal is, after a certain point, it's just going to be a sheer overwhelming force.
Yeah, I mean, Russia is producing something like 850 T-90s a year, right? That's at least double what America is doing, and they have some other ones that they are constantly upgrading and refurbishing. I don't know about the Armada, but they also have the Terminator, which is really, I personally think, as an infantry fighting vehicle, this is like the next level. It has two 30 millimeter cannons. It has these kind of grenade launchers that are really popular with the Russians, and frankly also because of the Soviet era, very popular with the Ukrainians. And some people might have seen them. They're like on a tripod, and a guy will be holding down the handlebars. And what it's doing is it's launching very quickly dozens of grenades that explode in the air, and they will cover like an entire area. Well, the Terminator has two of these right at the front. Um, it also has four anti-tank uh, launched missiles. I don't know if people have seen the videos that are happening on the northern front in the Kharkov, Lugansk, around the, just outside of the Oskol River. The Russians are using this in those forested areas, and it's just cutting like right through. So it's a very, very powerful vehicle. I don't know. I didn't find any statistics on how many they produce in 1 year. My guess is Russia's industrial capacity is very good when it comes to creating military material. So yeah, they're on a war footing basically. I think once it was obvious that there was not going to be any kind of negotiations. Um, I think they had to switch tactics, and sometime in the late summer, the decision was made that they would have to call on reserves. There would have to be some kind of mobilization, which I think they were afraid of doing for many months. I think it was held off, um, because a 6 month contract to all those Russian forces. Basically, it was up. War started um, in February, and they were done in August. So.
And with all that being said, there are rumors coming out. I don't want to give too much credence to these because I saw no real basis for them. But there is talk out of the Russian media and the Russian political sphere of declaring the Ukrainian government illegitimate, which would seal off any
That's right.
negotiation possibilities in the future. And whether that will come about is really to be determined, but as it stands right now, with the diplomatic situation between Russia and Ukraine, there is no room for negotiation. Ukraine will not come to the table unless absurd demands are met. And even you go back to Ukraine passing laws to stifle negotiations. And that was after, of course, the
Mhm.
failed negotiations that were interrupted by Boris Johnson in the opening weeks of the war. But as it stands right now, it would just be a formalization of current policy that the Russians do not recognize the Ukrainian government as legitimate. So I don't want to say anything for certain, but it would not shock me, depending on the level of escalation in the coming weeks, if that is something we do see in the near future.
Um, yes. You know, this would um, this would change a lot of things, given what Naftali Bennett said on that long 4 hour interview that he did with um, an Israeli podcaster. And I say this because if Russia does do this, does that mean that Zelensky is fair game? uh, the story that Naftali Bennett said, and again, I stress, it's not important whether this is true or not. What's important is that it's been said, right? That's what's important. So Naftali Bennett said that Zelensky had asked him if Putin was going to kill him. At this time, Zelensky was in a bunker. We presume somewhere in Kiev. And when Bennett arrived in Moscow, he asked, and people can find it. It's on Telegram. You can find the 4 or 5 minute clip, and you know there is translation from Hebrew. So um, he asked Putin, "Are you going to kill Zelensky?" And Putin said, "No, I'm not going to kill Zelensky." And he said, "I need your word. Are you, look at me. Are you going to kill Zelensky?" He didn't say, "Look at me," but he said, "I need your word. Will you kill Zelensky?" And he says, "No, I will not kill him." And the story goes, after his meeting, on his way back to Israel, he phoned Zelensky to tell him that Putin is not going to kill him. And then within an hour, in front of the green screen, Zelensky made his defiant speech, with some of his ministers like, I don't know if Zaluzhny was there, but Podolyak was there, and Shmuel was there, and
All these
Reznikov
names.
was there, and all these names, yes. And so he was defiant, and this is what I mean. Like, any generosity, they will look at that as weakness. It's like there's a recent video that just dropped like a few hours ago of Russian POWs getting shot in the head by Ukrainians, and these guys are wearing the green tape. It's not even the yellow or blue tape. These guys are just like, they're not one of the special battalion units like IDAR, Tornado, or Azov, or S14, or whatever. There's so many, really. There are many, many. It's not even 4 or 5. It's much more than that. But the Georgians do it, of course. So any generosity you give them, they will look at that as weakness, right? In a way, they have to reject the generosity, because for them, I suppose they think it's a trap or something. Um, but that's just, to give you an idea of just what kind of people they're dealing with. And so you see an example of Zelensky, making himself a hero out of Putin basically not targeting him. So what's going to happen if this is indeed not just a rumor, and Russia is serious of just calling um, the Ukrainian regime a terrorist organization? I mean, basically, they could justify it. They could say that yes, it is. They have plenty of examples. They have not adhered to the Geneva Convention, um, so forth and so on. They've attacked inside Russia. Um, I mean, all of these are fair targets, but if you want to get legal, you know, it will work. We're just talking about a value-free judgment. Will the reasoning in Russia work? Yes, yes, it will work, whether people like it or not. And so, if that happens, you know, um, is Russia going to step things up now? you know, Even in big publications like, as I said, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times of London, like, you'll find stories now talking about a major Russian offensive, and it's supposed to coincide. There's been a cold snap in Ukraine. It is in eastern Ukraine. It's all throughout, but it is also in eastern Ukraine. And temperatures are always in the minus at night. They go down to -10. Um, I've checked out even some spots in my former country. 4 o'clock in the morning, it's -9. So, and that's considerably more south. So yes, there is a
Now, is
cold
that
snap
9
there,
American or 9
and you can even see
European?
the footage from. That's not American -9. No,
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought.
um,
I thought it was 9
because
cells.
yeah, -1 is when water starts turning to ice in Celsius, basically.
Yeah.
Right. That's the. So there's an idea that there is going to be some kind of major offensive. Of course, we don't know whether there is going to be one or not. Um, there's all these leaks now. We don't know if they're leaks. We don't know if this is just disinfo, but apparently there was a Mossad leak about actual losses that uh, of soldiers on the ground, and they favored the Russians, something like a 7-to-1 ratio in dead and wounded. Um, you also have to think about how many Ukrainians have fled Ukraine. Where it's over 10 million now, right? And Ukraine was already less than its 40 million by the time the war started. People speculate it was more like 38 or 36 million. So it's considerably less than that now. It's people generally agree that there's less than 20 at best, somewhere 24 million or less. Some say as low as 18 or 19 million. Um, and you can see the press gangs are still active. This doesn't mean that boys will go to the front who are only 16, but boys as young as 16 do have to register. And I'm presuming that the reason they're doing this is, I don't know, as soon as these boys turn 17 or 18, that's when they're going to be sent to the front, because that means that they want to fight this war until victory. And that's why they're doing this. Um, so yeah, I think that's sort of the state of Ukraine right now. And of course it's Ukrainians that are posting these videos on Telegram, right? It's in Ukrainian. You can easily find them if you want.
Yeah, and I'm glad you had gotten some of the population decline numbers because that has been a consistent trend since 2014. From 2014 to the start of the war, it was about a million people a year. And then, of course, after the outbreak of the war, it has just been a complete hemorrhage. And with that, you may think that they've gone to Poland, in which, yes, a lot of them have gone to Poland and other places in Eastern Europe, a lot of places in Western Europe, and even the US at that point. But I think a good half of them, in general, since the start of the crisis in 2013, 2014, have also gone to Russia. So you do see that split
Yeah,
with Ukraine, with how they ethnically identify and where they go.
right. So more Ukrainians went to Russia than any other single country in the world, about 1.2 million. However, more went somewhere else rather than Russia. I think it's like, I don't know, like 8-to-1, 9-to-1 kind of. But like you say, I think of all the European countries, most went to Poland, but there's significant numbers that went elsewhere, including like even places like Ireland. And as you say, America. And I even know for a fact in Canada. Um, so but yes, the country that absorbed the single most amount of Ukrainian citizens is still Russia. I think they absorbed at least 250,000 to 400,000 more than Poland did.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about this today. There was
Um,
a story we did, I think it was in 2020 or 2021, about when Russia started expediting the process to get residents of Donbass Russian passports.
yes.
And that was long before this war started.
Mhm.
So a lot of this has been years in the making, and I think with the outbreak of the proper conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a lot of people, even in these spheres, tend to forget the build-up to these things and how it has played out just over the past almost 10 years at this point. I mean, come this fall, it will be the 10th anniversary of the Maidan and the quote unquote revolution of dignity, just to put things in perspective. And come this time next year, we'll be looking at the 10th anniversary of the annexation, or should I say, reincorporation of Crimea into Russia.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's right. Russia, of course, as probably a lot of our listeners know, has had its own parliament. It had tried to vote itself to rejoin Russia several times, and there were counter protesters in Kiev and other places that were from Crimea in order to stop what was going on. They weren't successful, and as I said, way back in the spring, Ukrainian militants basically opened fire on four buses filled with, men, women, and children who had gone to the protest. I'm guessing this would have been in late 2013 because by early 2014, those protests were getting far more violent, particularly February and the end of January. So, um, yeah, some dozens were injured and four people were killed. So you could see like really where this was going to go. People who want to eradicate other people that live in the same country that badly. Um, yeah, there's a lot of pent up animosity that is, I suppose you could say, seeking to be expressed. Um, it's unfortunate, but here we are.
And the last point I'll make on this before we move on to the story about Nord Stream is that I think a lot of people also underestimate the fundamental shift emigration has had on Ukraine, particularly when it comes to the make of this. Because you recall back in 2013, 2014 with the Maidan, as far west, although it is in the south, but as far as Odessa, had significant number of ethnic Russians and those sympathetic to Russia. And with the dynamics of Ukraine over the past decade, whether that be through emigration or terror tactics, I mean it's unthinkable that Odessa today is a city with any significant degree of Russian sympathy because of how much it has changed demographically, and not in any like profound
Yeah,
way like you've seen in Western Europe in the recent years of the migrant crisis, but just internal demographics with ethnic Russians and Russophones leaving the area, being replaced by Ukraine, being driven out of the area, or being driven into silence. And
yeah, that's exactly that's right.
you can
Yeah,
also,
Odessa was never like a Ukrainian city. You look at any consensus from the late 19th century, early 20th century. They don't make up more than 1 or 2% of the population in Odessa, right? And you even had as late as 2015 protests in Odessa over what happened. But eventually the hardliners got their way. And the same thing happened in Kharkov. Like they basically just drove or killed people out um, of the city in order that
well,
they could have it, right?
Odessa is where they burnt down that apartment block, wasn't it?
Well, they burnt down the Union Trade Building,
Yeah, that's what it
where
was.
Russians or people who didn't want to be part of the whole Maidan coup experience protested, and yeah, so they set it on fire, and anybody who tried to escape was gunned down. And it's kind of funny because way back last year, I believe one of the girls that was making the fire bombs, they got her photo because there's a video of her. It's all these women that are making these fire bombs, right? And laughing and giggling. And she was killed somewhere like near a battlefront. And I mean, even guys that fought in Azovstal in Mariupol are being killed now. They were former prisoners and they went back to the front and they're dead now. There's some other crazy news coming out of Bakhmut. Um, the areas that the Russians and Wagner have overtaken in Bakhmut, they found corpses with their hands and heads cut off. This is because they can't be identified, and it turned out that some of them were Polish and Israeli. Um, this is interesting because at the beginning of the war, Jews were exempt in Ukraine from having to fight, and Ukraine arranged buses to get Jews out of Ukraine and on and into Israel or wherever it is that they wanted, like probably America. So there are Jews who have gone back to fight for the regime. Um, I found that very funny that that would still be the case. Um,
I'm gonna put in
and
what
it
what might be a
mm,
controversial take is I think if we were to ever see a situation where Israel was in another conventional war and we actually compare the numbers, I think Ukraine would have more Jewish volunteers for it than Israel would. I mean
Mm,
that's all
mm-hmm,
just
mm-hmm.
purely hypothetically speaking, but I mean then you can get into the theory that Ukraine is supposed to be they're supposed to all return to Khazaria, which I don't necessarily believe, but I find it entertaining theory nonetheless. But I do think once again with that, and I mean although Israel isn't in a state of total war, you don't get too often where Jewish diaspora will go join the IDF out of some great loyalty to the Jewish state. In fact, you actually look at the numbers of Jewish
Yeah.
diaspora, their opinions on Israel are souring, which once again bolsters they see America as the ideal Jewish state. They are more than
Yes.
satisfied with their position here. As much as they might kvetch about the anti-Semitism or the increase in hate, or you might have a Congressman Moskowitz get up and cry about online anons bullying him with anti-Semitic memes or whatever. That happened again today. I saw a clip of that. That was just it was I admit it was hilarious how much he was crying about it. But again, they despite all of their complaints, despite all everything they say, I mean that's all part of the experience. But to reaffirm, they view America as far more of the Jewish state, far more of the promised land than they do Israel.
Yeah, Israel is symbolically important for them. I think most of them support Israel, but um, there's words and then there's actions, and actions always reveal preferences, more or less. And you remember about 2 weeks ago when we did a show, I said, or maybe when Gio was on, I said, in a way, they're not even taking care of their own narrative, you know, the Holocaust narrative. They're, like, by these strong associations with some of these battalions in Ukraine, they're not even, they're not even taking care of that. Like, um, it doesn't matter what these battalions say or how the media can refurbish them. Like, there's a history there. There is something that definitely did happen in World War II between these two people. And surprisingly enough, there was an interesting interview that took place between Evelina Zakimskaya and Alexander Prokhanov on Russia 24. It was featured by the JN1 um, channel. It's a Jewish channel, and basically Evelina said, like, what's gotten into their head, like, that they're supporting Ukraine and supporting, by extension, supporting these battalions, these Nazis, they would say. And then at one point she says, Prokhanov said, they're creating the likely scenario of a second Holocaust. They're actually making it possible. And then Zekimskaya, she says, it wouldn't be the first time. Now, I can assure you, neither of these people are going to get fired. They're not going to go to court. But that's what I mean about, they they're not tending to their own narrative. They don't nurture that. They use it very cynically when it's appropriate, because they always have goals, right? Now I'm just, I'm talking about those in, powerful positions, let's say, uh who determine the course for the rest. But I thought that was funny, and I'm thinking, like, why are you outraged by this? Like, that is what they're doing. What do you want?
Now, I'm going to get myself into potential hot water, but I do think that we're far enough in the broadcast where we can start to say, let's just say, things that are a bit more on the edge. But just for starters, the narrative needs much less tender affection considering the fact that the past year has shown us that Germany is completely capitulated, and unless they can turn this around on Russia, the narrative has more or less served its primary purpose. Now, of course, there are several secondary purposes like gaining the sympathy of several Western countries and et cetera, that also still is in play, but in terms of keeping the Germans subdued, it has more than succeeded, you could say. And then also, something I think is interesting with how cynically their talking heads, their representatives, use the narrative. I mean, because of course every narrative is going to have its cynics, going to have the people who advance it. for the agenda, but most people understand. Most people that don't have that sense of brazenness found in certain ethnic groups understand that you need to temper that. You need to be very tactful with that. But something I did see from Pew Research a few years back, I can't remember when the studies were conducted. I think this was particularly with the American Jewish population, that they view holding the memory of the Holocaust as a higher Jewish virtue than more or less any Jewish religious or cultural practice. It's like either the second or the third highest in terms of like what does Jewish identity mean to you? Like when they asked a whatever the sample population of American Jews was.
Yeah, like I think there is a struggle within this group. Like I think, like I say, Naftali Bennett saying these things
Isn't there
about
always
Zelensky,
though?
who is also Jewish. Like I think yes, I think what he's doing is he's hedging his bet that Ukraine is not going to do very well, and he wants to tarnish Zelensky, right? And it's also a way of keeping Israel out as much as possible out of the conflict. Now, the most interesting thing about that whole Senate episode was that literally the day before there was an article where where Israel said we're helping Ukraine a lot more than what you think we're doing. And then Naftali Bennett says this, right? I don't think he said it like um, to cancel out the other necessarily, you know. Um, I think there is a disagreement. Like I don't think they're creating some kind of dialectic to come to a new middle ground or whatever. I,
Oh
I
no,
don't. I
not at
think
all.
there's like I think there is like a serious disagreement that has happened, and for him to do that, it's considering uh, how much America spends on Israel. It's very brazen, and but nonetheless, he did it, and he's doing it. I think personally to um, keep Israel out of the conflict as much as possible, because it denigrates Zelensky. You know, you have like um, what's the David Rothschild who at the beginning of the war said 1,000 years from now there's going to be a myth about Zelensky,
Yeah, it's gonna
and
be
it
a
won't be
Jewish
100%
holiday.
accurate, but it'll be accurate. Yeah, there'll be a holiday and all the Jewish children in the world. Like, I mean, they are literally trying to build that, right? Like they want to make this war as significant as World War II to do a different kind of civilizational construction, right? And that is what has to happen for this to be successful, to be fully successful. Zelensky has to be successful as a Jewish leader of Ukraine.
And we'll
So,
see how that
and no
turns
matter
out
how
at the end
cringe
of
it
all of
is, like
this,
when,
but do go on.
yeah, I mean, he showed up at the British Parliament with a helmet, and it says, we want freedom to win. We just need your wings. Oh my God,
Yeah. Oh.
it's so cringe, and they just lap it up. And of course, he went in his his pea greens to King Charles III. He met with him. Like when you consider that he's meeting King Charles III, like that's a pretty big deal. Like they are completely behind it. And I remember in past years when I've sort of spoken about civilizations on let's say, for lack of a better term, on a more esoteric level, people kind of scoffed at that. And I get it if you're an engineer or you're a numbers person, but if you're a creative person, or if you're a more intuitive person, you cannot ignore this. It's kind of like saying the differences between Greek and Roman architecture and Gothic architecture are entirely superficial and represent nothing. I mean, that's absolute bullshit. They represent a completely different ethos. They even represent like a completely different mentality. It's such a dumb take, but I get it. If you're a numbers guy, if you're an engineer, yeah, you think as long as there are paved highways, it's all the same thing. It doesn't matter. But it's not like that. Um, anyhow, now we're seeing it, right? Now we're seeing a real civilizational struggle. And you know, the guys from World War Now who are great. I encourage everybody to go to World War Now on Substack. They had a recent one that they just published today, but I just briefly want to mention a podcast that they did a few days ago. And as you guys both know, Constantine and I are both Orthodox Christians, and they will go after the Orthodox Church. There's no question, and that is happening. And this is a civilizational struggle, right? Even Morawiecki said that you know, we've become like drug addicts to Putin, and you know, um, if we defeat Russia, the West will be rejuvenated. Like how? How will it be rejuvenated? I mean, getting more money isn't going to rejuvenate anything. It's going to make people kind of happier for a little while, but that's not going to change immigration policies because you only have a limited number of, you know, control levers, right? It's situational. And if they don't want you to be within regards of the EU context, if they don't want you to be homogenous, they will find a way to destroy you so that you're not homogenous, right? But right now they need you, right? You know, because this war ain't over. But I just wanted to say that this is a civilizational conflict. It's not a small matter. Even though it's not really existential for the U.S., it is, at least for the Russians, a civilizational battle.
Absolutely, and although it isn't by any objective measure a struggle for survival by the U.S., they have convinced themselves it is. So it has almost become that. The fact that they've staked almost the entire empire on that. Now, you could argue, and I would argue, that with the shifting of focus away from that, this is a loss that they can afford. But especially after Afghanistan, they sunk most of the remaining credibility into this, and if the Ukrainian war effort fails, which increasingly looks like it's going to, then it is going to be a massive blemish on their record. Speaking of blemishes on records, Nord Stream 2. So you had the Times,
Yes.
which is probably the most prestigious media outlet in the United Kingdom. If you would want an American comparison, it probably holds the same level of prestige as the New York Times would in the United States. Had a piece that reported on the investigation by Seymour Hersh, who his claim to fame is breaking the story of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and also he exposed the abuses at the Abu Ghraib camp during the Iraq War, as well as a few other things. He had a couple other dubious ones, like claiming the Bin Laden assassination was a farce. However, of course, the Times didn't say that, like, oh yeah, he's right about that, but this is his wheelhouse. These are the things that he investigates. He looks into these. And he had come to the conclusion, and once again, he's like 85 years old at this point, that the U.S., in cooperation with Norway, were responsible for the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, I know what many of you are thinking, as I had thought at first. Well, of course, that's a no brainer. And arguably, it isn't even worth bringing up on the show, except for the fact that you have, once again, one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious, media outlets in the UK, and also, of course, that prestige would carry over into the rest of the Anglosphere. English, once again, also being the global lingua franca. Anyone who's anyone has some understanding of English and has some dealings with the English speaking world, at least in the current structure of the world. when you have an outlet like
Hmm.
that admitting to it, it's completely that. Now, of course, the State Department came out and denied it and said, "Well, no, that's an absurd claim. There's no evidence behind this." But of course, they're going to say that. They're not going to outright admit something like this. Now, I even had that one Polish member of the European Parliament and former Foreign Secretary of Poland saying, "Oh, thank you, America, for this," with posting a
Sikorsky.
yeah, him with the picture of the
Thank you,
demolition site.
USA.
Yeah, that was yeah. Thank you, USA. You are my best friend. Just completely adopting the rhetoric of the Albanians at that point. But with all that being said, the State Department is naturally going to deny this. But there are two ways I can look at this. Either they laundered this through the British press because they want to admit it, they want to brag about it, and they want to say, we can do this again, and we will do this again, as something of a warning to Russia. Or this is a growing rift between the UK and the US, because although I doubt that someone like a Rishi Sunak or especially not a Boris Johnson are ready to capitulate on this war, the UK has had far more economic impact from this war than the U.S. has. And we had discussed some of that with some of the energy shortages, with some of the power outages in the UK. So it could be that there fundamentally is a segment of the British elite, whether that be in the media, politicians, or whatever, who hold a degree of resentment against the U.S. for so haphazardly leading Europe into this entire conflict without what seems like really a coherent plan to shore up Europe. I mean, of course, that was all part of the plan. It was part of the plan to kneecap Europe, but it. I'm not saying definitively, but I wouldn't rule out that there's some resentment from the British establishment to the point where they would point fingers at the U.S. and they would run a piece like this. I mean, it's either that or the West is outright bragging, the U.S. in particular is outright saying, and either as a warning or a display of their capabilities, that yes, they were responsible for this massive industrial sabotage.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very important shift. Now, before I get into that, I think it should be remembered that, like, if you want to understand the power shift, the deep state that's been in evolution post World War II, you have to understand that Seymour Hersh, in many ways, his whether he knows it or not, his function is basically um, to show failures primarily of American wars led by Republicans. And really, this makes what he's saying even more significant because, according to his story, uh, it was Biden that insisted on this, and the mines were put in place months before the detonation,
Oh, yes, 9 months, which,
and
if you do
that
the math,
it's been,
is before the war even started.
yes, right, yes, right. So the implications of this is really huge. Again, because Seymour Hersh, yes, he can criticize Bush. Um, when was the massacre in Vietnam? Was that under Nixon or was that
I
under
I think it was Nixon. I think it
uh,
was 1969.
yes, that would have been Nixon. So, because I think Nixon came in 1968 or was sworn in 69. And
Yeah.
anyways, there was this idea that like the U.S. from the U.S. right had to be criticized for going into Vietnam as a racist war because in many ways, like they would get everything that they wanted. On the one hand, they could make the post-World War II transition to like the woke culture that we have now. Um, and at the same time, they would set back Vietnam huge. And remember, Vietnam ended up in a civil war with China after the last American left. So America did get everything it wanted, including like this shift towards the left. The difference is now the left is in charge, like very openly. and it is their war. Liberals and Democrats support this war more than Republicans do. They both support it, yes, to varying degrees. And there's a huge number, but I believe with Democrats, it's still the majority. Um, so, and it's less so with the Republicans, but that's mostly because they believe that Ukraine can't win. Or there's too many problems in America, and you let's work on those instead of worrying about Ukraine.
Or simply the fact
But
that
for
it's
the
Biden's
left, on
war.
a civil right, right. For the left, this is a civilizational struggle. There's no question. So, and of course, they're always going to support Biden, and we'll get into that when we get into his address yesterday. But um, so Seymour Hersh coming up with this, he tends to be very careful. Like he is a professional. He has been doing this a very long time. Um, I don't think he's making it up. And what this means is there are people who want the war to stop, and they want to, if it means discrediting Biden, the most popular U.S. president ever, who stopped America from becoming a fascist state, then that is what they're going to have to do, right? And again, this is like, think about it. Seymour Hersh is criticizing and working to undermine a Democrat, not a Republican. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, and I think that was probably the most significant part of this because, yeah, you will get a lot of the quote unquote skeptics of the American empire, the quote unquote anti war people who exist to say more. I mean, now they won't outright say it, but they exist to say that Republicans are bad for waging the wars, but the Democrats, they can wage the wars because
Yeah,
they're more competent, blah, 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 blah. And that is effectively the role Hirsch has served for decades now, and it is,
yeah.
I would have to concur,
And there's some, yeah, I mean, there's people within that movement that never left it. Like they never realized it was a gay op. They're sincere. They are sincere. They are sincere pacifists. Like I would consider Mearsheimer and what's his name? Jeff. Oh God, I can't believe I forgot his name. Um, I would consider them, you know, well, I mean, I don't think they're hippies, but I think that that value of pacifism and moderation on behalf of the American empire is sincere on their part. But yes, uh, back during the Vietnam War and the Second War in Iraq, it did serve very, it served political ends. But eventually, the Democrats would have to take the reins of power, and here we are.
yes, and like I said, this is of a shock to nobody. I think anyone watching this program would not be shocked by that, but it does signal once again. It's the fact that that was reported and by who it was reported that is significant, rather than the actual report itself. And I think that trend will continue, especially as support for Ukraine does continue to sour and does continue to give more political ammunition to the right, because you even had Trump come out about a week and a half ago saying that, well, you see, if I was in power, we would have been able to negotiate into this war already. Which, I mean, which is a complete 180 from the fact that at the beginning of the war he's saying that Russia is committing a genocide, like really emphasizing that. He was on, I think, Hannity at that point, which I'm sure will shock nobody. But point being is, it does give ammo to the right, who theoretically would otherwise support the war, but for whatever variety of factors, find themselves tacitly against it. So there's definitely an interesting shift underway. And with Biden being thrown under the bus, I suppose we should get into his State of the Union just as the final topic here. So he
Hmm.
delivered his State of the Union last night, and which it was pretty standard. There were actually only three real points of, I guess, what could broadly be called woke, which at the beginning of the speech he mentioned something about some congressional act regarding marriage equality. He mentioned something about protecting the LGBTQIA children, and he called on Congress to pass a national abortion law. And then, however much you want to consider like the gun control stuff woke versus just standard Democratic tripe, which I would say it falls in the category of the latter. There's that, but it was mostly focused on the economic issues, and I'll say in a vacuum, if I were just reading this, had no context of who was saying this or why they were saying this, if I was just reading the words alone in a void, I would say, yeah, most of it sounds pretty reasonable. Some of it's maybe a bit too far to the left for me, but generally very reasonable statements and proposals. Now, I don't believe for a second that there's any feelings of genuinity behind this or that Biden is going to actually address these issues in any significant ways, but it did show that Biden and his team and the speechwriters, at least, had a grasp on the situation that people don't want to hear about the LGBTQIA stuff. They don't want to hear that much about the race baiting stuff. Now, of course, he said he went on some of the BLM stuff, not to any great extent, less than I actually would have expected. But of course, there were the usual concessions to the state religion, as it were. But it was mostly focused on very practical issues, which I do think showed that at least they have their finger on the pulse. They know what people want to hear, and they're trying to moderate the position away from some of the more radical stuff. And you have seen this lately, and I do think this, in fact, actually warrant a show in and of itself. The tacit shift away from the American civic religion, also known as in the common tongue as wokeness, for lack of a better term. I again, I really don't like the term, and I could go on for about an hour why I don't like the term, but I'll use it for the sake of simplicity here. But with with that being said, you do see a tacit shift away from it. You see them abandoning the excesses in order to reaffirm what they've already gained, such as the acceptance of something like gay marriage, such as the legalization of abortion, such as the policies they've taken towards policing and more or less letting uh, tacitly ignoring the issue of crime so long as it doesn't go too far, so long as we have the, I guess is what other people have called as anarcho-tyranny. Once again, just for the sake of simplicity, I'll use that term regardless of any specifics about it, but it was a very theoretically moderate speech, which, once again, I do think that shows that Biden is the finger on the pulse. But what I found much more interesting is, now I will admit, I did not watch the Republican response. I never watch the response on these things. I just generally don't see the point in it. But hell, I couldn't even tell you who gave the response. But it was interesting, even with some of the more moderate talking points, there were moments of rabble and discontent where it was like audible grumbling from the audience, like people like audibly like just more or less, I mean, not in these words, but more or less saying that's bullshit, Joe. That's not happening, or you're not going to do this, or uh, yeah, or you're lying right through your teeth. And that was particularly on like a lot of the economic issues when it came to it. That the Republicans saying like, and again, it was kind of hard to make up, but there were, I would say, about three or four moments I noticed. Now there may have been more of audible like rabble and disagreement with Biden, where to the point where it actually did interrupt the speech. So that was an interesting dynamic, even though I think that is just more or less speaks to what people expect from the political sphere nowadays. They want it to have sort of that like I guess you could say that like television quality, that like drama and intrigue, and that's what makes it interesting is the fact that like oh, this is just like whatever primetime television show I watched 5 years ago. How interesting! I mean, that's what a lot of the State of the Union is. Don't get me wrong, but like with some of the rabble rousing, well, I do believe that yeah, there probably were a few people who generally thought that a lot of it probably was just that, and was to play into just sort of the dynamics of it with them being the good, controlled or approved opposition. But ultimately, what I do have to say about the speech is I was expecting to come on here and say like, well, Biden is out here calling for an LGBTQIA global revolution, but in fact, you actually look at it, Trump's 2019 State of the Union, which always sticks with me because that is the one where he called for the campaign to decriminalize homosexuality globally, that he made that a foreign policy objective. That one always sticks with me. But even look at some of the stuff he said in that speech, his 2019 speech. This was arguably less pause. Now, I'm not saying this is some great praise of Joe Biden, but I'm just saying Biden and his team and the people around him, maybe if not him in particular, they can they can feel what direction things are going in, and they are somewhat acclimating to that and not pushing their luck with it.
Yeah, it was a strange speech. I'm glad you mentioned that it was very pragmatic. They had a lot to say about Biden rather had a lot to say about like Medicare and all that. About how to keep costs down, which I imagine would have been very popular. But he did his trademark antics, which is to talk very quietly and then scream like an idiot. Um, they were, of course, gun control was one of them. But my favorite was he mentions that the country is, how do you put it? Well, let me begin with this. Last year and the year before, he was talking about there are less democracies and more authoritarian regimes. It wasn't at his State of the Union address last year, but in different um, platforms that he spoke.
Yeah, that
Okay, and then
was
this
that.
one he
Yeah,
says democracy. Dem- Democracy has never been stronger. Like, I mean, what happened? Oh, yeah, that's right. This war happened, so now suddenly democracy is very strong. People thought that NATO was finished. It's like, who was saying NATO was finished? Like, really, who? Right? It's a state of things. Whatever. It's an unknown. How strong is NATO? I don't know. It's like 28 countries. Like, is that really weak? Like, there were a lot of straw men in this speech of his, right?
well, I can
And then
very
one of the most ridiculous moments.
I can actually
Go ahead.
very easily translate a couple of those statements for you. So, NATO has never been more united, and democracy is stronger than ever means Europe is more subjugated than ever.
Yes, yes, exactly right. And also, there's nothing like me convincing you of a foreign threat for us to put aside our cultural differences here at home. But which he alluded to, of course, right? And that had one of his loud moments. However, I think one of the most important parts of his speech, where again he did this quiet, loud, was when he brought up China. He implied that the stupid weather balloon that they shot over the coast of South Carolina was a breach of American sovereignty. Like, this is so ridiculous, right? Like, China has 300 satellites that we know of. 100 of them are military satellites. Like, they're massive. They're not enough stupid weather balloon. This was a weather balloon, but I think one of the funny things is there's been a Jazz Hands Alex Mercurius crossover. They both believe that. I mean, it's possible, but I love it for the lulls. Okay, don't get me wrong. I love it for the lulls that they both think China released this balloon in order to play America, because well, it's true. America did that to the Soviet Union all the time, and the Soviets. That sometimes they would chase them and shoot down the balloon and so on. But this was not a U2 moment where, although Bono was there, But this is not a U2 moment where the Russians said we shot a U2 plane and America denied it, and then the next moment, they have the pilot of the U2 plane. Yes, they did knock knock the plane down. I'm a prisoner in the Soviet Union. So um, uh, so another thing he says, we want to compete with China, and defeating China in like he means economic competition should bring our country together,
Lifted
right?
straight from
Like
Trump's
these are
rhetoric, mind you.
all exactly, exactly, and people just lapped it up. It's like, remember when all the stupid shit libs were afraid there was going to be World War III, because Trump was too harsh on China. Like, remember when they thought Trump's vaccine would be dangerous? Re, it's just one thing after another, right? It's always who whom. It, and it was true for this. Now, of course, we're not talking about the public. We are talking about congressmen and women and senators and joint chiefs of staff and judges. But nonetheless, the speech was stupid, and you could tell that he spent very little time talking about Ukraine, right? Except the usual tropes about democracy and all that nonsense.
Well,
But
another actually interesting point of
he
lifting
did,
Trump's rhetoric is that he talked about bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. And when it came to China, he talked about the semiconductors in
yes,
Taiwan, to the point where once again he is borrowing these, I guess you could say, populist economic talking points in order to try to rally the public behind him. Because of course, if we have a strong domestic economy and a foreign rival to overcome, then of course America is going to be united forever, and we're going to overcome every challenge. That there's no challenge America has faced that it hasn't come out stronger for was one of the other ones that he did the quiet loud thing with.
yeah,
But
yeah.
once again, it was a very middle of the road speech. It needed to be. It was not the place for. Because you go back and I have revisited these things from time to time. You go back to some of Obama's ones where he is very adamant about pushing the agenda forward, which was his role. Don't get me wrong. I mean, first black president. What do you think he was there for? But somebody with Biden, when faced with the circumstances that he is, the turmoil that he had to play these lines of rhetoric. He had to adopt the Trumpian rhetoric that, once again, 4 or 5 years ago, they were denouncing as insane, radical, going to lead to a world war, economically illiterate. But those were messages of unity now. So there has been that back and forth where they do have to adopt the talking points. Now, once again, I will say for anyone out there, now I doubt that any of you fine folks would assume this, but just putting it on the record, that I don't believe that Biden genuinely believes in these things or is going to move to implement any of these sort of like economically populist programs or anything that's really substantially beneficial to the American people. But it's what needed to be said, and that's the point. The fact that he couldn't yammer on about the LGBTQ issues. He couldn't dedicate an entire speech to Roe versus Wade. He couldn't
Yeah.
dedicate an entire speech to police brutality and race relations in the United States. It's similar to how, say, Obama might have, but he needed to address pragmatic concerns because of the situation which he finds himself in, which does put the position that America has
Hmm.
never been stronger into it calls that into
Yeah, never
question a
been
bit.
stronger.
Yeah, when because I mean you could
Never more united.
yeah, never more united, never more subjugated. Once again, that applies to the American heartland as much as it does to Europe. But point being is, like, when America actually is in a comfortable position, you can have the Obamas of the world trying to advance the agenda. But when push comes to shove, when you actually have to have a coherent response, that's the kind of speech you have to give, which is the speech Biden gave. So I would say it
Yeah,
was.
and to add to what you're saying, he
Yeah,
did
go ahead.
also talk a lot about infrastructure, which is a very pragmatic concern.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'll just say as my final note on this is, although I wasn't taken in by it, politically, I do think it was a victory for Biden, this speech. I do think that it got across what he wanted to, and aside from a bit of rabble, I think the general American population who might just watch the evening news or whatever, although they might have skepticism of Biden because of his previous political career, they probably were taken in by this. I'll just say that much.
I think that's a fair analysis, and I think it's we on the right probably don't want to hear it, a lot of us, but I think it's true, and I think it's a fair analysis. I I don't know who Biden's doctors are, but like let's face it, every time, whether it's the Dark Brandon speech in September or this, like when it counts, they have the drugs where he doesn't sound like and act like a buffoon. Like
Yeah, this
clearly
wasn't the
they're
2020
measuring out these
debates.
doses. I'm not kidding. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Like they are doing that. I think there was only one time where he was just slightly tongue-tied, which is not the norm, let's be honest. Um,
And once again, we're talking about Joe
because
Biden.
everybody knows how many gaffes he makes.
Even when he wasn't senile, he was still a terrible public speaker.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's always had this style where like he's I think it's even more exaggerated now, which makes it more comical, where he talks super quiet. He's just whispering. Not a joke, man. Although he didn't, I do like it when he says man.
Come on, give me a
And
break,
then he
man.
just rails. My favorite is authoritarianism is getting weaker. Who who traded spaces with Xi? And everybody's going like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Like a lot of people did. It took me a day to figure it out. I think like he's saying, what president of a democracy decided to become an authoritarian? We've passed the test. Is that what he means? I mean, that's got to
I
be like
I think
one
so.
of the lamest things ever. It's so lame. I mean, what you think this war is like I mean, you're the authoritarian here, like, but let's take you at your word, right? I mean, who became more authoritarian besides Zelensky? Like who? I mean, but for him, that's a victory because, of course, they think like if they see authoritarianism as successful, people will want to imitate it, right? That's what he's trying to imply. Although it's very hard to understand what he meant by that when you hear it for the first time, or at least it was for me, anyways. But it was another moment where he's got his fists in the air, like it's just so ridiculous. I think he loves doing these things. I really do. I think he practices, and I think, like you say, he did a fairly good job, boring as it was. I think he convinced his constituents.
Yeah, he did what needed to be done. Like I said, the American public is, of course, always going to have that baseline distrust of politicians just because of, especially in this country's history, just the nature of politics. But a convincing speech by somebody who doesn't sound absolutely insane, although Biden had his Biden moments, he didn't. That's going to be enough to smooth over things for the average Joe, at least until the next election cycle.
Hmm.
But that's all I had. If you have any final notes on any of the stories, I suppose now would be
Um,
the time.
the only thing I'll say, and I'll use Zelensky's words as a platform. Zelensky, by the way, as you said, did go to France to meet Macron and Schultz. I think it's interesting that Schultz went to Paris to meet Zelensky, and Zelensky. So he also went to Brussels to meet what's her name, Ursula von der Leyen. Um, Basically the cesspit of weasels. So from there, he's from there he's going to go to Poland and meet with Duda, right? I have a feeling that this is, that's going to be the culmination. They're going to go really big with this, right? And just the way Duda received like enormously welcoming applause on the streets of Love. I think something similar could happen for Zelensky. I don't know. Uh, Probably to a lesser degree, but I think that's what they hope will happen. Uh, Only because I think Poland is more weary of Ukrainian refugees there, while Ukrainians in Western Ukraine are happy for any assistance, and the sacrifice of about 1,200 Polish mercenaries. So um, I'll just say most of the fronts are for the Russians, anyways, are progressing quite well. The Russians continue to make gains in the basically the edge of the Lugansk-Kharkov border towards the Oskol River. There are rumors that the Ukrainians might give up Kupiansk, but they are making significant inroads into this area. They have been gaining ground and not losing ground for several weeks now, small as they are, but they have. The other is the Wagner Group now is inching very close to Solidar, but I will retract my prognostication that they will go after Solidar. I don't think they will. I think the major that might come later, but the major development now is all happening around Bakhmut. Wagner is now right on the doorstep of Ivanovskoye, which is a town directly in the middle between the western side of Bakhmut and Chasov Yar. There is no road that the Russians couldn't shell. So all the roads now that were safe the last time we did the show are not safe now. The Russians have also gone around Krasnogora, and they've moved far more westward now compared to what they were before. And now they have from the north the ability to shell the most northerly road that goes into Bakhmut. There was a Ukrainian officer who said that 1/3 of Bakhmut is now taken by Wagner and by Russian forces. And interestingly, while Zelensky was in the UK, he said Bakhmut is not important. The city is destroyed now. Remember when I said way, way last year, I said they don't care if all these places get destroyed. What they want is to see all these places destroyed because they know that the vast majority of the population doesn't want them there. And they will hold on to those places because they're playing a war of attrition here, right? They believe that the Russian public will snap sooner than the Ukrainian one because the Russian public doesn't have as much of an authoritarian apparatus against it as the ideologues in Ukraine, and because there's always the hope that the West will intervene. Um, However, he did say it's not important, but we have to hold on until fresh armaments come in. So, you know, which one is it? Um, the only other thing is fighting in Ugladar is, as I said last time, is very heavy. There are major losses on both sides, and the Russians are now trying to get to a hill. I think it might have been used for mining. If they get that, it will cut off the northwestern road that connects it to Marinka. So, anyways, that's it for the front lines for now.
Well, of course, we'll certainly have more on next episode regarding that and a bit more of a detailed overlook of it. But thank you, everyone, for tuning into this, I guess you could say, midweek episode of the War Report. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.